All right, so let's go to the poll.
Oh, so I see what the black box is.
Okay. So I just launched the poll and you'll be able to respond. So you don't have to type your comments in the chat, okay? Yeah, preferably for you to answer the poll, and that way you're not influencing what other people are writing.
So you're going to see a poll show up on your own screen.
Yeah.
And you're going to see those the buttons.
Options, yes.
Yeah, just pick, hit one of these buttons and you've answered your poll.
So if you don't see a poll, it might be that you've moved, maybe there's something that you've done on the screen of your Zoom. Because there's so many people who are responding.
Yeah, so many people, some people are saying there's no poll.
Yeah.
All
right, so we're going to keep going. I'm going to end the poll and I'm going to share the results.
Okay.
So do you see the results?
Yeah, I see the results.
Okay, all right.
You measure.
So I'm just going to advance this.
Okay. Oh, you've advanced the poll.
Yeah.
Well, it looks like we're doing pretty well. About some 2% of the class choose ordinal categorical, and that makes sense. But there's also some people who chose nominal categorical. So can I have someone who chose nominal categorical to just tell us why they might have made that choice? Or do I have someone who chose ordinal categorical who wants to tell us why nominal categorical would have been a wrong choice?
So Gloria, I'm going to let you to talk, allow you to talk.
Go ahead, Gloria.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, Gloria.
Sorry, it's Bejo. Okay, the reason why I chose ordinal categorical is because, first of all, the categories here they are categorical, and there's a sense of order. You see that when you move from 1 to 4, their blood pressure is increasing. So that's why I choose. I think ordinal categorical is the best answer there. And I'd not choose nominal because, as I said earlier, there's an order. If there was not order, then nominal would have been better. So since there's an order here, the right answer is C. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Brego. Yeah, thank you, Brego. Because there's an order, and that order has some quantitative implications. So it is ordinal categorical and not nominal categorical. We can move on.
So yeah.
There's a slide before that, right? Before proportions.
So maybe I have the wrong version.
Okay, let's just move on. So now that we understand variables, the next thing we want to understand is that when you bring two values together, because a lot of the analysis, a lot of the time when we're trying to describe a population, we would need to combine more than one concept, and we'll see what that means. The easiest way in which we combine more than one concept is what we call a ratio. And what's a ratio? A ratio is just one variable, that's the numerator, divided by another variable, which is the denominator. And you have to understand what the ratio is very well, because a lot of the analysis that we would do subsequently, in terms of statistical analysis, would involve what we call ratio measures. And that's what it is. But here, there are two things that I want you to note about your ratio, though, is that the numerator and the denominator do not have to be related at all. For instance, we can say that, let's see, so for instance, you can say, let's compare how many adults to kids we have in this, in the particular study. So you can say, for every 3 adults, we have just 1 kid. So if you are looking for the child to adult ratio in this study, it would be 1 to 3. Another less intuitive ratio that I've seen someone calculate before is to say, well, looks like people are more interested in tech companies than they are in hospitals in some parts of the world. And maybe that is more, an Asian phenomenon than it is an African or European phenomenon. So to make a comparison, someone was calculating what is the ratio of how many hospitals in a country compared to how many tech companies you have in a country. You should know that there's not a lot of relationship between a hospital and a tech company. So one ratio is how many hospitals per tech company. Those are 2 very different entities, but that is still a ratio. The point I'm making is that the numerator and the denominator might be related in the ratio, but they might also be very, very different. It essentially depends on what kind of question you're trying to answer or what type of concept you're trying to understand. And the thing with a ratio is that it can take any number. It can take any number, because you might end up having 15 hospitals compared to a tech company like you have in most African countries. And you might end up having fewer hospitals than tech companies like in some countries in Asia. So the range can be, from one end of the number range to the other end of the number range. But there are 2 important types of ratios, special ratios that would also talk about, and those are important. It is important because for you to know the difference between a ratio, just a ratio generally, and some special cases, that's the proportion and the rate. A proportion is a ratio in which the numerator is actually a part of the denominator. So for instance, now when we talk about hospitals to tech companies ratio, for instance, hospitals are not tech companies. So the hospitals to tech companies, while it's a ratio, cannot be a proportion. And that's why when you're trying to get a ratio together, you need to understand the numerator, you need to understand your denominator, understand how it is being measured, and that's when you can tell whether this is just a ratio but would now qualify as a proportion or a rate, or this is not only a ratio, it is a proportion. And when we get to other kinds of analysis, or when you get to other kinds of methods, you will understand why that distinction is important. Now, just to give you some of the popular examples, popular types of ratios that we use, like the prevalence, for instance, popular types of proportions. The prevalence, for instance, is a proportion. And why is it a proportion? A prevalence essentially is, how many people, how many cases of a disease do we have? That's the numerator. And the denominator is everybody in the population. Because the cases are also part of the population, that makes the prevalence a proportion. So, and sometimes you can have point prevalence, which is at this point, how many cases do we have compared to the whole population? Sometimes you have period prevalence, because sometimes you're conducting a study, you're trying to measure prevalence, but you just can't measure all the cases in the population at a point in time. Sometimes it takes up to 6 months to measure all the cases in the population. So you might say, what is the prevalence, period prevalence, from January 1st to December 16th, and January 1st to June 1st. So that's what we call a period prevalence. But essentially, it is still counting how many cases do we have. No, we're talking about cases here. I didn't say new cases, meaning that if we're looking at the period prevalence of, say, COVID, between period prevalence of COVID in Lagos between January 1st, 2022 and June 1st, 2022. If you had someone who had COVID in December 2021, but still had COVID until January 1st, 2022, even though that person is not a new case in 2022, that person will still be counted as part of the prevalent cases. Now, the other kind of proportion that's very popular in epidemiology and statistical analysis is cumulative incidence. And what's cumulative incidence? Number one is the total number of incident cases. And what makes a case an incident case is that the case just occurred during the period that is of interest. So for instance, if we're looking for the cumulative incidence from January 1st of COVID from January 1st to June 1st, if somebody developed COVID in December 2021, but still remained uncured until January 2022, that person would not qualify to be counted as part of the numerator, because that case is not new in this period. So you would count people who had new diagnosis of COVID just being recorded after January 1st up until June 1st. Now, and here's where you need to understand that cumulative incidence is a proportion. So if it is a proportion, the denominator here is not just everybody in the population. It is the people who are at risk, because we have said that this is a proportion. Therefore, those who are cases, that's the numerator. The denominator must contain those who are new cases. So the point here is that, you see, for several reasons, there might be people in the population who cannot have COVID anymore at that point in time, whether because they have been vaccinated, assuming that vaccine provides complete protection, or because they've just had COVID. Those kind of people cannot be counted as part of the denominator because you're not individuals at risk. And the denominator in cumulative incidence is just individuals at risk. So, the bottom line here is that understand that proportions are different from ratios, in the sense that the numerator, everybody who's in the numerator, is also included in the denominator in proportions. The numerator is a portion of the denominator in proportions. And the two most popular kinds of proportions are prevalence and cumulative incidence. And a proportion, because the numerator is a portion of the denominator, a proportion would always be between 0 and 1. It will be a fraction, because the numerator is, just by definition, the numerator is the fraction of the denominator. It's a fraction. Numerator is a fraction. It's part of the denominator, just by definition.
Okay, we have a few questions. Maybe we can take them.